You ever look at some of the weapons people used in the Middle Ages and just think, who the hell came up with this? Because it wasn't just about winning a fight back then. It was about domination, fear, and making sure your enemies remembered what you did to them, if they were lucky enough to survive. These weren't weapons made for clean kills. These were designed to crush, tear, and torture. Some were so vicious, even medieval authorities said, yeah, that's too much. In an era not exactly known for mercy, that says a lot. Number 1, the crossbow. The crossbow wasn't just another weapon in the medieval arsenal. It completely shifted the balance of power on the battlefield. Before its rise, skilled archers trained for years to master longbows. You had to build strength, practice daily, and develop a feel for wind, distance, and movement. But the crossbow changed all that. It gave almost anyone the ability to kill a heavily armored knight with very little training. You could be a peasant with no military experience, and with a little instruction, suddenly you could punch through steel plate with a pull of the trigger. That was unheard of before. This made the crossbow especially dangerous in the eyes of the elite. It was a weapon that didn't care about class or training. You didn't have to be noble, you didn't have to be strong, and you didn't even need to aim all that well. All you needed was the weapon and the nerve to use it. That terrified the ruling class, particularly the knights and those in power, because it made them vulnerable in a way they hadn't been before. Crossbows worked differently from longbows. You pulled back a string using a crank or a lever, loaded a bolt, which is shorter and heavier than an arrow, and then released it with a trigger. It didn't fire as quickly as a longbow, but the power behind each shot was intense. The bolts flew at such high velocity they could smash through armor that would easily deflect a standard arrow. And unlike a longbow, which needed a skilled hand to use effectively, a crossbowman just needed a steady aim and some patience. This power led to some serious pushback from the church. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council issued a ban on the use of crossbows, specifically against other Christians. The council described the weapon as hateful to God, which tells you how seriously they took it. They weren't trying to ban it outright from all warfare, just from being used in conflicts between Christian nations. But the reasoning was clear. The crossbow made killing too easy, too impersonal, and too brutal. The church was essentially trying to keep war from becoming even bloodier than it already was. They wanted to preserve some level of honor and restraint, especially among Christian combatants. Of course, this ban was largely ignored. Wars didn't stop just because the church said they should. And when people saw how effective crossbows were, especially against armored cavalry, they kept using them. The ban didn't apply to non-Christian enemies, so in the Crusades, for example, crossbows were used freely. Knights and mercenaries saw the practical advantage and didn't hesitate. The weapon continued to spread, getting more advanced over time, with better mechanisms and more deadly results. Interestingly, the use of crossbows also had ripple effects beyond the battlefield. Since these weapons gave common people a way to kill knights, it contributed to a shift in social dynamics. Suddenly, the battlefield wasn't just a place where nobles dominated. A peasant with a crossbow could take down someone who had trained their whole life for combat. That started to break down the traditional military hierarchy. You didn't need a noble birth or decades of training to be dangerous anymore. That was revolutionary. Eventually, cities and rulers began regulating crossbows for civilian use too. They saw the potential for uprisings, for street violence, for assassination. Some cities banned their use inside the walls. Guilds controlled who could make and sell them. It wasn't just about war anymore, it was about maintaining order. The legacy of the crossbow is huge. It's one of the few weapons in medieval history that truly democratized killing power. It scared the elites, angered the church, and gave common people a lethal tool that could change the outcome of a battle, or even a war. And that's exactly why it ended up on the list of forbidden weapons. Number 2, the flail. The flail is probably one of the most iconic and misunderstood weapons of the medieval world. At first glance, it looks straight out of a nightmare. A wooden or metal handle, linked by a chain to a spiked or solid metal head, swinging with a kind of wild freedom that most weapons just don't have. But its origin is far less terrifying. The flail actually started as a farming tool used for threshing grain. Farmers used it to separate the edible part of the grain from the husks. It wasn't meant for war at all, but in times of chaos and rebellion, peasants and workers turned to whatever tools they had. The flail, with its brutal swinging power, quickly became something else entirely. As it made its way onto the battlefield, it didn't stay in its simple farming form for long. Blacksmiths began modifying it, adding metal heads, spikes, stronger chains. Suddenly, this everyday tool was now a battlefield weapon capable of smashing through shields and helmets. That chain between the handle and the striking head? It gave the flail a serious edge. Unlike a sword or an axe, which could be blocked or deflected with a shield, the flail's head could whip around a shield and land a blow anyway. That made it particularly dangerous for knights, whose heavy armor wasn't always enough to stop the momentum of a well-placed strike. But that swinging chain also made it unpredictable. If you didn't know exactly how to handle it, the flail could come right back and hit you instead of your target. It took real skill to use without injuring yourself. That's part of why it never became the main weapon for most medieval armies. It was too hard to control in the heat of battle, especially when formations were tight and chaos was everywhere. Still, its raw power was enough to keep it in circulation, especially during sieges, uprisings, or in the hands of rebels who didn't have access to more refined weapons. One of the reasons the flail got a reputation for being too brutal was its association with peasant revolts. When regular people rose up against lords and kings, they often didn't have swords or spears. They had tools. The flail became a symbol of rebellion, something that frightened those in power. Not only could it kill, but it also represented the threat of the lower classes rising up with what they had on hand. Authorities didn't like that one bit. In several medieval cities, carrying a flail was outright banned. Local laws would prohibit them inside the city walls, partly to keep the peace and partly to prevent organized rebellion. On top of that, the kind of injuries a flail caused were horrifying. A sword might give you a clean cut, maybe even a quick death. But a flail? It could cave in your skull, break your ribs, or snap bones with a single swing. The injuries were gruesome, often fatal, and left a mess that haunted witnesses. That brutality made it not just a weapon of war, but a psychological weapon too. Even seeing someone wielding one could be enough to make an untrained fighter think twice before engaging. So while the flail never reached the popularity of the sword or spear, it carved out its own bloody place in medieval history. A tool of the common man turned into a weapon of chaos and fear? Too effective to ignore, too dangerous to trust, and too brutal to be allowed unchecked. Number 3. The Morning Star. The Morning Star looked like something straight out of a nightmare. Imagine a solid wooden or metal shaft, and on top of it, a heavy iron ball covered in sharp spikes. That's the basic design. At a glance, it might seem similar to a mace, but the key difference was those brutal spikes. While a mace relied purely on blunt force to smash through armor or bones, the Morning Star added piercing power, making the damage even more vicious. It didn't just dent or bruise. It ripped and tore, leaving opponents with injuries that were nearly impossible to treat, especially with the limited medical knowledge in the Middle Ages. What made the Morning Star especially terrifying wasn't just how much damage it could do, but how little skill it required. You didn't need to be a trained knight or an expert swordsman to use one effectively. Swing hard enough, and you could easily break bones or puncture through chainmail. That accessibility made it popular among foot soldiers and lower-ranking fighters who wanted something deadly without a lot of training. But that same simplicity was part of the problem. Because anyone could pick one up and cause serious harm, it became associated not only with the battlefield, but with street violence, torture, and even public executions. In certain parts of Europe, the Morning Star developed a nasty reputation for being a weapon of cruelty rather than combat. Some historical records link it to executions where condemned prisoners were beaten to death as a form of public spectacle. The combination of blunt trauma and spiked injuries made for an especially gruesome death. Broken limbs, crushed skulls, and deep puncture wounds were all part of the package. This association with torture and excessive brutality led some city-states and religious authorities to ban or heavily regulate its use, especially during times of relative peace when carrying such weapons in public was seen as a threat to order. Another reason the Morning Star drew so much attention was its symbolism. It wasn't just a practical tool of war, it became a symbol of domination and terror. In some depictions, guards of lords or bishops carried morning stars not only for defense, but as a visual warning, not a reminder of what could happen to anyone who defied authority. That's partly why some regions limited their use to official soldiers or guards and outlawed them among common citizens. The idea was to prevent riots or revenge killings that could spiral into uncontrollable violence.